As the developed world struggles to recover from the long-term fallout of the global financial crisis, will it pursue a fundamental reorganization of the international economic order? The present unstable economy, failure of Eurozone reforms, and fragile global financial system are among the key challenges that leaders must face in the present age of uncertainty.
Good morning, I'm Philip Stevens from the Financial Times, and as that short introduction showed, in this session we're going to widen our gaze somewhat from the region and look at the condition of global capitalism in the wake of the 2008 financial crash. I think I'd posit that the state of capitalism really depends on where you're looking from. If you live in Europe, as I do, you tend to think that the crisis isn't really quite over yet. If you spend 2 or 3 days, as I have this week, in Seoul, you can't really see much of a problem with the market economy. But there is a problem in the global system. We heard Christine Lagarde say the other day that we're living now in a 3-speed world, with the new economies, the rising or risen economies of this part of the world still growing strongly, with countries like the US beginning to recover quite strongly, and sadly with Europe still, including my own country, this isn't just the Eurozone, including Britain, still sort of locked in this third division. We also heard recently from Pascal Lamy, who said that world trade last year had grown by only 2%, which was, apart from the year of the crash, one of the lowest levels we've seen for a very long time. And I think we also see, if you look at the global financial system, in many respects, a renationalization of global finance. I think the national regulation now is cutting across the liberalization which we saw before the crash, and indeed which many blame for the crash. I think the response to that from the G20 was initially very encouraging. We saw some pretty decisive action at the summits in Washington and in London. Since then, it looks like the G20 has sort of fallen, if not into disrepair, into abeyance. Hasn't taken on the responsibility. We have a number of questions in this session about the key challenges to the capitalism model. I think one of them is, can we continue to have a globalized, interdependent economic and financial system without the tools of global governance to deal with? But we have a great panel to discuss this issue. I'm going to ask each of them to speak and to hold it to about 5 minutes, because if possible, I'd like very much to engage people in the audience in this discussion. We've got about 1 hour and 10 minutes overall. But I'm going to start with Dr. Park Taeho, who is the former Minister of Trade, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade here in Korea, who's a candidate for the WTO Director Generalship, and ask him to give a perspective. I mean, am I right, seen from Korea, what's wrong? Everything looks pretty good to me.
Well, thank you, Mr. Moderator. As you said, I just come back from the very intensive competition for the new Director General of the WTO after Pascal Lamy. I'm not an expert on financial or macro issues, but we talk about the global governance. So maybe I will briefly mention about the crisis and reform directions for multilateral trading system. During the DG race, we talk about this with our ambassadors working in Geneva. So I have a more kind of sense of realistic feeling from those people. As you know, Doha round started 2001, didn't get any, progress so far after 12 years. So mainly, when I see this, the main reason why we are not having conclusion is that the expectation of the gains from this liberalization negotiations are different between emerging developing nations and advanced nations. So they cannot make any compromise. And also at the same time, developing and least developed countries are not happy since development issues are not properly dealt with. And also many people say that regionalism is rising, lack of political leadership, especially from advanced countries, since we are in a world economic recession, and also lack of willingness to make concessions by large emerging nations, and also at the same time lack of trust of the WTO leadership among members. In any case, I summarized the current issues into two main important issues. The first one is compromise between advanced nations and emerging large economies like China is not making any progress, especially US versus China. And you have to understand this because China became the WTO member 2001. And this is exactly when the DDA negotiations started. And China felt that we have enough market opening through the previous 10 or 15 years of accession process. So why should we open more? But now 12 years have passed. Maybe China should change their mind and participate in this process. And second fundamental issue, as I see it, is unfair distribution of gains from trade among participating nations, especially developing and developed underdeveloped nations don't feel like WTO is providing any benefits to them. And if you go to a national economy, in this case, through the income redistribution policy, you are helping unemployed people or weak industries or the firms in difficulties. But if you talk about world, there's no world government. So maybe developing country and least developed country is having tremendous problems. I think we have to deal with this. Maybe this is a little bit related to the crisis management or reform plan. So the reform direction, I will finish shortly. Reform direction should be large economy like China must show some leadership in the WTO. Then US, EU, and India, Brazil may move. And as you know, WTO is an international public good. So every stakeholder should pay its own due to maintain this public good. And second reform direction should be unless developing and least developed nations feel that they can gain something from the WTO, the multilateral trading system cannot move ahead. So WTO must help developing and least developed countries as if national government, as I said before, helps small and medium enterprises or weak industries. Of course, WTO is not a fundraising organization, so we must help with, we must closely consult with international organizations like a World Bank or regional development institutions. So if you look at the least developed countries and developing countries, if we provide them more preferential market access, that's not enough because some countries having supply side restrictions. And also, if we resolve the supply side restrictions, their trade facilitation infrastructure is so bad, so they cannot participate in the trade. So I think each developing country or least developed country has different need. So I think we should pay more attention in consultation with other international organizations to address these specific issues. I think this is very important subject for reform kind of direction in the future for multilateral trading system. And the new Director General has a huge task, not only to finish the Doha round, but also to address these fundamental issues. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Buck. I think you make a very powerful point that the preservation of the multilateral trading system is absolutely vital to, if we're indeed to preserve globalization. I mean, perhaps in the in the discussion we can come on to whether the trend towards regional trade agreements, whether it's EU-US, whether it's the Trans-Pacific, whether it's EU-Japan, actually contribute to or subtract from the drive to multilateral systems. But I'm going to turn now to Kwon Goohoon, who's the chief Korea economist at Goldman Sachs, and he worked previously at the International Monetary Fund. And in that context, I'm sure he has prepared comments, but I'd like to also add a question to whatever he's prepared, which is the global architecture, if you like, the Fund, the World Bank, the G20, fit for purpose in sustaining an open, liberal, capitalist system?
Thank you, Philip.
Small question.
Yeah. I focus on a little bit on this financial market issues and talk a little bit about how I think to be key challenges, including just G20 architecture. I think there are I can frame two issues facing the global economy or financial market or capitalism, if you want to say. First one is cyclical issue. We tend to ignore the cyclical issues and focus on structural issues like a permanent big. But at the end of the day, if you look back, what happened to 2007-8, what triggered the current debate, in a way, was this global financial crisis. People could have a view whether this crisis was inevitable, structural problem, or people have a view that this could be cyclical, another cyclical issue, which prompted by probably China getting into WTO, global imbalancing, and the surpluses and deficit and the financial market. So I guess the near-term cyclical issue which faced the world is still how to get out of the recession or how to get out of the fear of recession or risk of recession. Because as Philip, you mentioned, three-speed economy, Europe, Asia, US, slightly different kind of path to the recovery. And still, numbers are kind of mixed, slightly good numbers in the first quarter, but you see some weakness in numbers. Today, Korea, export number for April came out, which is as of yesterday number, right? So very fresh number is quite weak, only 0.4% year-on-year growth, which is no growth actually. And the second cyclical issue is then after that how to unwind the liquidity, excess liquidity you could say. I mean, Japan is now pumping up like 7 trillion won every month, which is almost $70 billion, and the US is adding $85 billion every month. Global liquidity is more than ample, and then there is no inflation risk for now, but at the end of the day, let's say 2015, 16, there will be some unwinding of that liquidity coming from the developed economy, which is good, right? Because otherwise they won't unwind that. But then what happened to all this the periphery countries or just developed economies, which in a way benefit a lot from ample liquidity and perhaps over-leveraging. So if the process is not carefully coordinated or done gradually, there will be some victims. And then some countries will be very unhappy about it. Maybe there is another kind of mini crisis down the road because of that. So that's kind of cyclical issue, which I think we should take a look at it. The second one is a structural issue. Obviously, it's a big issue. I'm not the right person to talk about it. I'm sure some of the audience have a better view on that. There are two pillars, I think, of the global economy. For the global economy, one was free market, and the other one democracy. And then issue is how to harmonize that two pillars going forward, especially for even to US and China. About the G20 platform, it is true that the G20 get a lot of momentum 2 to 3 years ago when there was common interest by relatively large countries. But after this first wave of crisis and recovery, I think there's less homogeneous opinions about the role and the contribution of G20. So I think broadly speaking, going forward, the 5-10 years horizon, there will be a lot of discussion about whether G20 platform is appropriate, and more broadly, whether international organization like IMF, World Bank, the governance is proper, fit to the changing world. Let me stop here. Yeah.
Fine. So thank you. Setting out very clearly there the cyclical problems, whether of restoring more balanced economic growth, and dealing with the liquidity issues that will be coming, but also, again, this question of the gap between a very interdependent economic and financial world and, if you like, the renationalization in some areas of responsibility for oversight of this world. Guy Sorman is, like me, one of the few Europeans at this, lucky enough to be at this conference. We were just talking earlier, and he remarked that it was odd that Europe isn't part of the discussion here, and why wasn't there a session on the Eurozone? I thought that was because the Asan Institute was being polite and didn't want us to relive our problems, but I think Guy takes a rather more upbeat role on that. But he's a contributing editor at City Journal, which is published by the Manhattan Institute, and he's taught economics at Paris University for 30 years, and he'll give us I think a European perspective on some of these issues.
Well, I don't know if I will give you a European perspective. I will give you a free market perspective, because I must say that I've been flabbergasted by the title of this session about the crisis of capitalism and global government. I mean, we don't live in a capitalist system, we live in a free market, free trade system. And if we start by using Marxist vocabulary, and we understand nothing. So I think we should really get rid of this vocabulary, and we have to repeat that if we are in a world today which has been able to escape out of poverty for most of the people on earth, it's because of free market and entrepreneurship and free trade. And this is what is to be preserved. And democracy, as you justly said, also is absolutely fundamental, okay? And so when we talk about crisis, instability, well, a free market system is unstable by definition, because it's based on innovation, because it's based on trial and error, because it's based on destructive creation. So I really don't understand why we are talking about the crisis of the capitalist system. I think the vocabulary is totally wrong. And if we use this kind of vocabulary, we'll go to totally erroneous conclusions. That's the first remark I wanted to make. So now, second remark I want to make. We all talk about slow growth and things like that. I mean, we have to remember that the long trend, if you look at the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century in Europe, the trend was a growth rate of 2% per year. So to pretend that you are in a crisis because you don't go beyond 2%, well, this has to do with a misunderstanding about what economy is about. Of course, to be elected, you need to promise that the growth rate will be 7%, but this has no meaning in mature economy. So let's go back to a scientific approach of what economics is about. Now we are talking about global institution and world institution and how to regulate the market and so on. Well, I'm very strongly, or to put it another way, thank God we don't have a global government. And because we have enough problems with national governments. And if Europe is in such a bad shape, it's because we have so many ill-managed governments which are unable to balance their budget, which have created huge welfare state, which are financially not sustainable anymore. So government is not the solution, government is the problem at a national level. Now let's imagine for 1 second that we would have a global government. So we will have a global problem, and of course it wouldn't be a democratic government. Having said that, I certainly do not deny that we need some form of permanent arena for discussion. And as we all mentioned the G20, and you mentioned the G20 in Washington, in London, I want to mention the G20 in Seoul, which took place right after the 2008 crisis. Because the South Korean president, and I don't say that to please the South Korean here, and because we are in South Korea, but it's well admitted that the South Korean president at that time was extremely convincing to persuade the American representation and the French representation that free trade was to be kept if we want to go out of this crisis. And free trade has been saved by the G20 in Seoul. So I do think that this kind of meeting is absolutely essential. What also we need at a global level is a better, how should I say, fact-checking system. We don't know what we are talking about, basically. And if you look at the 2008 crisis, I mean, I speak under your control, about derivatives. Nobody knew exactly what the quantity was, what we were dealing with. So the permanent problem now we have at a global level is that we don't have the facts. And I would be very much tempted to propose to replace the IMF, which is a completely obsolete organization which has been created after World War II to solve problems which do not exist anymore, which employ, I don't know, 10,000 bureaucrats, I think. So I think the right size for the IMF would be 200 people. But 200 experts with a very important role and which would help the government to know the facts. And the lack of knowledge of the facts is absolutely essential. Another institution that we absolutely need, and maybe this should be the role of the WTO, is that the rule of law at a global level should be respected. That the rule of law should not be flaunted, that there should be no hidden subsidies, that everybody should respect the same kind of regulation. So I do think, to summarize, we need three kinds of institutions. We need a place to discuss, and the G20 is the right place, okay, a forum, so that poorest country would say to wealthy country, which happened in Seoul, look, we were poor 30 years ago, we are doing fine because of free trade. So don't kill the emerging countries by stopping free trade. This is seminal that the G20, okay, whatever name it has in the future. Second, we need a fact-checking institution that the IMF number 2, 200 people is enough, and we need a new, 300, you need a secretary. You need some assistant to make your phone call. And we need a third institution, which should be the WTO, to be sure that everybody respects the rules. Because what do we want? We want all to grow, but to grow slowly on a sustainable path, not to dream about, even China will not stay at 10% because China has become a mature economy, okay? So we have to be reasonable. So a sustainable pace, and to be sure of that, the rule of the game must be respected. The rule of the game must be respected, and the WTO should be in a position to say to China or whatever country, you don't respect the rules, you are giving subsidies to your export companies, you don't respect property rights, and so on. If the rules are respected, if entrepreneurship is respected, if we have a clear panorama, let the entrepreneur do their work, which is growing the economy, and let the government do their work, which is to implement a stable rule of law. And this is, I think, the kind of separation of power which made the world better off, and I don't see any better future in kind of a big technocratic organization with a global government going out of the blue.
Okay, thank you very much. So, very clear message there. Free markets, free trade, and less interference from national and indeed from global governance with international institutions slimmed down. I must confess, it's not the prescription that one expects from a French colleague or one often hears in Paris, but the more refreshing, I think, for that.
Look, may I protest, like in the British Parliament? I mean, we should all get rid of two stereotypes, that all French love red wine, I don't, and that all French are socialist, I'm not. Okay?
Thank you for that. So we're going to turn to our last panelist, Dr. Yang Baoyun, who's a professor and deputy director of the Center of Asia Pacific Universities at Beijing University. I'm sure, in part at least, he'll respond to your provocation. We should have a completely liberal, laissez-faire, libertarian market system. But I'm sure he'll also give us a perspective from Beijing on how we deal with what some of us at least still think are the problems of global capitalism or global markets and free trade.
Okay, thank you very much. And before entering my topic, and I want to just some words as the introduction. Firstly, I'm not economist. I'm working on the international relations with especially the political, historical, and the social cultural aspect. But I think that with the end of the Cold War, there are very important trade in the world. And there are much more the links or the relations between economic and politics. And I can say that the phenomenon is the politicalization of the economy. And the economization of the politics. And just for this reason, I have talked also made attention on the evolution of the economy situation just for the international studies. And secondly, I'm not a generalist for the old world studies. I take more attention on the East Asia, particularly in the Southeast Asia studies. But I think also that with the globalization and the regionalization, we must put every country, region, in the background of a big region, all global. It means that we study the Southeast Asia or East Asia, we must put it in the background of the Asia-Pacific region, even in the world background. And just for this, the global crisis or revolution has many impacts on the special countries, regional organizations like ASEAN, etc. And just for this reason, I accept to present my reflection and opinions here with the topic of the crisis and reform of the global capitalism. Because for the Southeast Asia, most are the developing country, and there are many problems with the system, especially the capitalism, etc. And firstly, crisis. I think that the crisis of the 2007-8 is a very important. This crisis gives many impacts on the global evolution. We can remember in Southeast Asia, in 1997, there also a financial crisis. And at the beginning, we talked that we called it the crisis of the Southeast Asia. And after the enlargement of this crisis, and it began to the East Asia crisis, because not only the member country of the ASEAN, but also the impacts on the Korea, for example, Japan, and even Russia and the American Latin, etc. Sometimes I use some French word for support my. Okay.
Thank you.
Because my first foreign language is French, not English. Okay. We can, for the nature of the crisis, in the 1997, this is a crisis from the developing country. The impacts and the influence were relatively limited. But this time, for the 2007-8, and this is from the founder and protector of the actual capitalism system, United States, developed country like the EU and other, including Japan, etc. And in this case, the influence and impacts of this crisis is totally different than crisis of the 1997 in the East Asia. And the consequence of the crisis are certainly different. We can find in the 1997, there are also the troubles. For example, in Indonesia, in 1998, with the social trouble at May of this year, and there a change of the president notice system. But after, with the evolution of the situation and the democratization of some country of the Southeast Asia, there are the change. But this time we can find there are much more the conflicts in the world. Even in the developed country, we can find that there are the occupation of the Wall Street in the United States. We can find there with the reform of some European countries like Greece, etc. There are many protestations and all the in Greece, etc. But especially in the developing country, there are much more problems. We can find that the revolution in the North Africa and the Middle East, etc., is the direct consequence of this crisis. It means just like I said, it means that actually there are much more the links between the political affair and the economic affair and the political affair. The economic crisis can give more seriously on the political aspect. We can say that in the North Africa and the Middle East, there are the two crises, not only in the economic, financial field, also the political, social, even cultural. And in this situation, and the crisis, I think exists. Not exists is very serious. And you said that what is the crisis? I think this is the crisis. Not only economic crisis, but also the political. And with this crisis, and there are also the evolution of the situation. Especially, I think that the balance of the power, not only in the political, but also the economic field, began to change. Especially for some countries like China, India, etc., we can say that the member country of BRICS are considered as the emerging economic communities. Certainly, not only these 5 countries, there are also many developing countries has a relatively good situation. And we talk about the capitalism. I think if in the field of this financial crisis, I prefer to say that perhaps this is the problem of the capitals, the system of the capitals. We can find that now for the emerging countries, the capital can use to invest, etc., and much more augment. And they play a role much more active than before in the field of the investment in the world. And another side, for some developed country, that the problem of in this field. For example, now we take many attention on the reform and evolution of the situation of the Myanmar, Burma. And since 2 years, and this country has many change, many reform, etc. And we know also for some country, and there are also many critics on the Chinese investment in this country, etc. And now we find a phenomenon that, and things around the 2 years, we can find the Chinese investment have many problems. For the dam of Mission is stopped, and the pipelines have some problem, and the copper mines, Levitan, has also some problem, etc. And for some Western country, the European Union, the United States, etc., have permit with your democratization, and we can have more investment in your country, etc. But 2 years, we cannot find that in this country, and the foreign investment go down. And now even, according to the last statistic, even not more than the 25% in comparison of the 2 years ago. Yeah. Why? Because they are no so much the Chinese investment, and they are not the new investment. I have been in this country last year.
I'm going to ask you just to sort of wrap up.
Okay, yeah, no problem. And for the reform, I think reform, they are the the domestic reform, especially not only for the developing country, but also the developed country. But reform is not easy. I don't talk too much on the domestic reform. But for the international economic and the financial system, we must have also the reform. And since the end of the Cold War, we try to establish a new political order and international political order and economic order, but we have many problems because I think the survivor of the ancient order cannot, don't like to say they are to the new emerging country. But now we find that with the crisis, etc., even the developed country have to accept some reform. For example, just after the crisis in the 2009, and G20 accepted to have the more portion of the developing country in IMF, also the World Bank, etc. Because we haven't enough time, I don't like to enter in the details. As the conclusion, I think that the crisis exists, and the crisis of the capitalist system, especially the capital system, has many impacts not only on the developing country but also on the developed country, and it impose necessity of the reform, and some country choice their reform way. We must have said for different country there are the different concrete situation, and their way are also different. We cannot try to unify the way of the reform.
Dr. Yang, I'm going to stop you just there because I want to open up and say...
Just 2 seconds. And secondly, the crisis, the ancient crisis has still many the power. Now it's not possible to change completely the system. But we need some reform. This is beginning, and I hope that we'll have modern reform, and we can find as early as possible a solution of the crisis, and to try to establish the world more harmonious. Thank you very much for attention, and excuse me for the...
Now look, our panel's given us some very interesting insights and some opposing views from what crisis, let's just forget about it, to, as we just heard from Dr. Yang, there is a serious crisis. What I'd like to do, rather than me just sort of cross-examine them, is open it up to you for comments, for questions, for compliments and criticisms. All I'd ask is that you give your name and keep it relatively brief. So who would like to make a statement or comment? The gentleman there. I know some of your names, but not all, but I'm going to pretend to know none of them, to be polite.
My name is Charlie Kupchin from Georgetown University and the Council on Foreign Relations. One of the issues that was beneath the surface in the panel discussion was rules and the potential transition to a new rules-based order. And I would like to hear from the panelists, particularly from Dr. Bark, because he actually mentioned this question about Chinese-American cooperation or lack thereof in the WTO, and the views of emerging economies that the system works to their disadvantage, not to their advantage. If we were to write these rules anew, and if it was China and other emerging economies that were more influential, what would those new rules look like? How different would they be than the current set of rules that exist within the international financial institutions?
Okay, great question. Any other comments? Yes, the lady here. We'll come back. We'll take 2 or 3 and then come back.
I am Seo Yu-kyung from Gyeonggi Cyber University, and I'm teaching at the Department of NGO Studies. And my question goes to Sorman. Well, today you didn't disappoint me because I thought you had been a good friend of Koreans, and certainly you did not. So thank you very much for that. But actually, today is the Labor Day. And you certainly disappointed many laboring people in the world. So I think my question is very brief. That I thought you were a kind of a socialist, as you know, the most French are, but you happen to be the neoliberalist. Then, on the contrary, I am Korean, but most Koreans seems to be capitalist, but I am social democrat myself. So, you think about the free market and free trade, but you don't really go for capitalism. So that seems to me that you just give up 99% of workers in the world. So what do you think about the free labor market in the future?
Okay, great. Anyone else? Okay, we'll take those 2 for now. And first to Dr. Bark. And it's a great question, really, if Korea and the other newly emerged economies were sitting down and someone said, okay, you can write the rules of the new system and the organizations. What would they look like?
Very difficult question. And again, I'm in the field of trade. So maybe I address to you regarding the rules of international trade. If you go back to the history before the GATT system, or starting with the GATT system, the rule of law in the trading system exclude the industry of agriculture for many, many years. That means every country did whatever they want, mess up, Now they are integrating that agricultural sector into the WTO, applying the same rules. Very, very complicated. It's not for only developing country, but also for advanced country too. So that's why we got stuck. Sorman says the free market, no subsidies, but developed countries are doing huge subsidies in production and export areas. Now they want to dismantle this. Politically impossible. So then developing country says, you are not doing anything, why should we? So it's very complicated. So that's one point, and then also textile also, I don't want to spend too much time. But if I want to write the new rules of law at the WTO, we have a kind of clause which is special and different to developing countries. They are all flexibility conditions. You don't have to do this. You can delay the obligation. That's very, what should I say, inactive, very, it's not, proactive kind of rules. I think we need to help them a little bit. So maybe instead of flexibility, we should give them some assistance, not in terms of financial assistance, but we give them some assistance so that they can build more capacities to trade. I think that this is a direction we should consider in the future. I will just stop there.
Can I also ask you, though, to the question that I had as well? When you look at these regional trade negotiations that are extending, and indeed Korea has its own agreements, do you think, if you look at, the Pacific, the US proposals for Trans-Pacific, which Korea, do you think, well, this is a route into a multilateral system, or don't you think actually this will give people an excuse not to reach a global agreement?
Korea has many FTAs, including US with EU. Now we are negotiating with China, and I'm asked most frequently what kind of trade policy you are doing, and then you are running for WTO is kind of in conflict. But this is kind of chicken and egg kind of question. WTO is not doing very well. Many countries are starting to depend on regionalism. But what I'm saying is here, as a more realistic trade policy practitioner, I think regionalism is another option to promote the free trade. However, if you don't include most dynamic part of the world in the big, FTA, more serious FTA, like a TPP or transatlantic FTA, they don't include China or India or Indonesia. So they can achieve something, but not greatly. Maybe they can achieve some harmonization of regulations or standards, but they cannot, promote or provide momentum for world economic growth. So that's why it's much more important, even though we have lots of regionalism, it's much more important to promote multilateral trading system like WTO. Okay. And if TPP and transatlantic thing succeed, and we are doing within Asia, we call RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. If they are all succeeded, then maybe they can be merged together. Then we may go to the multilateral trading system. That's how I see it.
Okay.
Yes.
Dr. Kwon, from your perspective, how would the rules look if they were rewritten, as it were, from in Seoul and Jakarta and Beijing, rather than in Washington and Brussels and elsewhere?
Well, I'm not sure what the world needs is new rules. I think probably better execution of the rules we agreed. I'm not particularly kind of on this rules issue. I'm not actually familiar with that, but my personal view is that things got wrong, but I'm not sure that required actually entirely new rules. Probably you need a better execution.
Okay. Do we need new financial rules? I mean, one of the things that we're seeing now, and you must see this at Goldman Sachs, is the fact that cross-border financial flows are being seriously constrained by domestic regulatory systems. So European banks, as it were, aren't lending to other European states and indeed to Asian countries because their domestic regulators are saying, look, you need X amount in terms of reserves. So we are seeing a sort of contraction of the global financial system. Do we need harmonization of rules there, or should we just let it happen?
I'm not. I think this is above my pay grade question. Probably Mr. Sorman can
Go
better answer on that. I'm a believer of the merits of the free market, and then therefore, in principle, I'm not a strong proponent of all the rules.
Okay. Well, I'll just perhaps risk taking on Mr. Sorman. There's a question there, a particular one for you from a Korean social democrat to a French neoliberal, which is a sort of odd conjunction. But before you answer the question about how Labour should be treated, in your much more liberal, laissez-faire world, how do you square the need to regulate banks nationally so taxpayers don't, as they've done in Europe, pick up the bill, if you like, for private sector mistakes, with the need to keep capital flows flowing across borders? I mean, in your system, how do you, in your slimmed down free trade as opposed to capitalist system, how does that work?
First of all, I don't like the word laissez-faire, which I think is a British word because we never employ it in French. And I read it in
the audience could see how well the French and the British get on.
Yeah, I always read it in the Financial Times. No, more seriously about banks, my position has been very clear from the beginning, and I took a public position on that after 2008. I did consider that banks were normal enterprises and should be treated as any normal enterprise. And if they were ill-managed, they should go bankrupt. And this should not have interrupted the financial market. I mean, the new companies would have taken over. So we have created since 2008 what has been called a moral hazard. And this is certainly not good. And so I'm very coherent on this. And I don't consider banks to be above the law and above regulations. And it's only because of their lobbying, the connection between Wall Street and the U.S. government that wrong decisions have been made. Okay. And now, if I may, very, very rapidly on trade, I want to support what has been said regarding subsidies, and mostly the European Union subsidies to agricultural export. This is extremely shocking, and because we support a very small number of very big companies, but which are very powerful lobby. And this plays against the poorest country on earth, mostly in Africa and Latin America. And also this must be clearly said. One more observation of rules, and rules must be adapted, but some rules are universal and good for everybody, including the poorest country. I just give you an example. Many African countries since 10-15 years, under the influence of some IMF experts, have understood that they need a predictable currency and independent central bank. And since they have adopted this rule, which is the rule of monetary predictability, you see growth in many African countries, which is often not taken into consideration, but this is a direct consequence of a better monetary management and better implemented rule of law. And now to come to the labor market situation, and I love debate. So you are social democrats. I think a Korean social democrat is the equivalent of a French conservative. And but I think debate is good, and especially on labor laws. And of course, the labor market must be regulated. No debate about that, okay? I fully agree. The problem is where, do you draw the line? How do you do the fine-tuning? We know, for example, in France right now, that unemployment, mostly among the younger people, is a direct consequence of labor law regulation. Because you cannot fire anybody, therefore you don't recruit anybody. So the problem is not not to regulate the labor market as such, is to find the right balance between the kind of regulation which will protect the workers from exploitation from the entrepreneurs, but also you must have some kind of flexibility so that people can get in and get out. So I think on this basis, and we should discuss about facts, not an ideological debate, and we could find a solution, including in South Korea, where the regulation of the labor market is a huge problem, and this kind of fine-tuning and right balance have not yet been found, and I hope it will be. That's one of the virtues of democracy, that there is room for debate.
Thank you. Dr. Yang, you said that the system needs reform. One of our questioners has given you an opportunity. If very briefly, in a minute or so, just perhaps to take one or two of the institutions, if Beijing were writing the rules of the new system, what would be the big things it would change, whether in the WTO or indeed at the IMF?
Okay. Since the end of the Cold War and the Chinese government called away on the establishment a new international political order and the new international economic order, I think including also for the economic field and the financial, etc. I think with the crisis, the Chinese attitude was always active to continue to improve this reform. Yeah. And it wants also to play a role active in this reform. And I think that the contribution of the Chinese side to the actual economic institution reform is a relative active, because also recognized by the other countries, especially developed countries. I think just also for this reason that Chinese proportion of the right of vote, or the proportion of the investment in the World Bank, etc., have the augmentation, and it means that it can play a role more active, more useful in the future reform of the. If you want to know what is the concrete program of the reform, what is the conception of the new constitution of the, I think it's not with my such a field.
Okay, thank you. I want to turn to the audience again. Now, you've been quite quiescent, but you can't possibly agree with all the panelists because they're saying different things. So I'm going to see, can I tempt anyone to make a contribution, make a comment, ask a question, or is everyone... There.
Well, thank you so much. I think this morning we have been talking a lot about the rules, especially WTO rules. And I think when you think about WTO, we should be thinking about different functions being performed by the WTO. One is making the rules. Second is applying the rules. Third is adjudication. And I think we could be just seeking to seek the right balance among the three. And I think it is extremely difficult to come up with the new rules, but at the same time, adjudication and implementation would be equally important with coming up with the new rules. And let me just try to point to one example, which is Minister Park. He has been referring to the subsidy question in the agricultural sector. And then there is WTO dispute panel system. And then there was a case where I used to sit as a member of the panel. The panel was upland cotton case. And the thing is, the US government is in fact supplying certain generous amount of subsidy to the upland cotton case, upland cotton, and as a consequence of that litigation, that is to say WTO upland cotton case, then it was decided that in fact the US measure should be put into conformity with WTO rules. So I think coming up with new rules is important, but at the same time, there are other functions at the WTO, and then that is the reason why we should be having a little bit more positive appreciation of the WTO. The second point I wish to make would be this, which is I'm coming from the G20 session earlier this morning, and then I used to work as a G20 shopper for Korea, and then I was invited as a panelist there. And one of the things I said in that panel was this, which is we are thinking about large number of measures which have been taken at the G20, and then maybe we could put them into two different categories: short-term measures and long-term measures. When it comes to short-term measures, I think the performance of G20 has been relatively successful. That is to say, deal with the crisis of 2008. G20, in fact, was rather successful in putting together right measures in terms of fiscal policy, in terms of monetary policy, and that is the reason why the worst could have been avoided thanks to G20. But later on, when it comes to long-term measures, again, we are talking about the rules. Long-term measures, we are talking about the new rules. They should be put into place. And then what we mean by the new rules is the new rules in financial regulation, new rules in macroeconomic management, new rules in the reform of international financial institutions. I think, again, even when it comes to long-term measures, important progress, meaningful progress has been made. But the thing is, given the nature of the long-term measures, that is to say, coming up with new rules, it cannot but take time. So that is the reason why we tend to have the perception that after the several initial meetings of the G20, then the effectiveness of G20 petered out afterwards. But I think that is simply because of the difference in the nature of the questions addressed through the G20 process. Short-term measures, it was relatively successful. But when it comes to long-term measures, given the nature of the measures, it could not but take some longer period of time. By the way, thank you, Mr. Sorman, about your kind words about what we try to achieve through the G20 summit in Seoul. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, could I ask you just to keep the microphone for a minute? Because I'd like to ask you a question, which is the problem with the G20 its size, or is it a lack of political will among the big players? One of the things that I hear is that China on the G20 doesn't want to do anything that might be seen to compromise its national sovereignty. And on the other side, the US feels much more comfortable dealing with its more familiar partners in the G8. So you have an organization where, for different reasons, the two big players don't really have the political will. Is that your experience, or is that an erroneous interpretation?
Well, Philip, I think, again, you are coming from the assumption that G20 is not performing well. But my assertion has been that it is, in fact,
no, in the short term. I'm talking about in its discussion of longer term.
Right. Right. But at the same time, there is an anecdote I wish to share with you, which is, let us just think about how G20 came into place. It was in response to the financial crisis of 2008. And at the time, I remember there was a speech made by President Sarkozy at the United Nations General Assembly. And then here he said, we are dealing with a global financial crisis. And then response better be globally coordinated. And then what he suggested was that if it can be coordinated through G8, then it's fine. But G8, maybe it is too small. So we should be coming up with something larger. But he didn't specifically mention what he meant by something larger. So in Korea, we thought about G13, where it will be G8 plus 5 countries, or G20, because we had this G20 finance ministers process before that. And then, in Korea, we definitely wanted it to be G20. Later on, I was talking to my Chinese colleagues, and then I came to find that between G13 and G20, they, in fact, were in favor of G20 as well, for which I was a little bit puzzled. So I asked my Chinese colleague, why do you prefer G20 rather than G13? Because G13, you'll be one of 13, but G20, you'll be one of 20. And then the response coming from my colleague in China was this, which is, G13, somehow we cannot shed this feeling of second-class citizens. Why? Because it will be centered upon G8 plus 5 countries. But G20, it was already there in the form of a G20 finance ministers meeting. So that is the reason why we prefer G20 rather than G13. Other than that, with respect to China, the level of Chinese participation or intensity of Chinese participation in the G20 process, I have to say China was very constructive in its participation. Okay. And then one of the things which I already mentioned in the G20 panel earlier this morning is, I know that there are Japanese colleagues as well, and both Japan and China want to host the G20 summit meeting in 2016. And in my mind, it is one indication that, G20 is being kept in high esteem by large number of countries, including China. And I think it augurs well for the future of China, for the future of G20, but also for the future of Chinese participation in various different forms of international bodies.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Buck, the WTO should concentrate on enforcing and implementing the rules that it's got as much as trying to write new rules. How do you respond to that?
Well, implementation should be the highest priority in the organization. But so far, we have been doing something for developing countries. But they don't feel like they are getting anything. So maybe we have to focus a little bit on development issues as an organization of trade. So we are using lots of methods like aid for trade, capacity building, but we must concentrate on specific need of specific country with the consultation with other international organizations like the World Bank and Regional Development Bank, so that each developing country can feel they can have some help or assistance from this organization. This is a fundamental issue I'm addressing. Yes.
Okay, Dr. Kwon, do you have any comments on either of these 2 points about G20 or World Trade Organization, or do you want to? And I suppose, Mr. Sorman, you think it'd be better to abolish the G20 altogether?
No, not at all. On the contrary, I said it has been extremely useful because it's informal. And I think that the strength of the G20 is that there is no bureaucracy, no set rules. I mean, it's a place where everyone can speak very freely, when even the number of guests is not, it's 20, but there are other guests which are invited. So I think that the way things should work, and also the G20 has been extremely important to convince the whole world that there are no national economies anymore. There is only one global economy. So the G20 is typically the modern kind of management of the global economy. World Bank and IMF is the old kind, and it corresponds to the after World War II situation. But we are in a flux, and this kind of very flexible organization which the G20 represents, it's exactly the kind of institution that we need, and it should stay like that.
Thank you.
Just a word for the G20. For my idea, this is a platform for the dialogue between the representatives of the developing country and the developed country. And the two sides can show and present their position, their idea, but it's not a system to find a solution on the concrete problems. Mm-hmm. Yeah, perhaps in the future we must try to do something to establish a new system for the G20 like the G8. It means that two sides can have a true cooperation to find a solution for the common difficulties and problems. But we have still very far way to.
Thank you. That's a great last word. A young lady at the back has been putting up a sign saying, please end. So I think we'll end, and I think we'll end by thanking our panelists for a fascinating discussion and for their insight. Thank you.
Thank you very much.